the urinary system. It will benefit us to have a little more time when we get to the hard stuff in this, so I want to go ahead and start now, even though it's sort of out of sync. But it will at least prepare you for what we'll do after the break. Okay, so the urinary system, particularly coming from the digestive tract, is far, far simpler, right? There's many fewer organs, there's many fewer moving pieces. But what happens in the kidneys is fairly complex. So there isn't a lot of macroscopic anatomy that's important, but the microscopic anatomy and physiology is. But ultimately, the urinary system is the kidneys, one on each side. The kidneys filter wastes and excess fluid and electrolytes from the blood. Okay? And so therefore, they are the source of urine. So urine is formed in the kidneys. It collects in the collecting system, which we'll talk more about in a little bit. Flows down to the bladder through two smooth muscle tubes called the ureters, right? So there's one on each side. Then we have the urinary bladder, and the urinary bladder connects to the outside world through the urethra, right? So we're going to spend most of our time talking about the kidneys, and then at the end we'll talk about micturition. Micturition is the fancy name for urination. Okay, so we'll end with that. To refresh your memory, sitting on top of each kidney, like a little party hat, are the suprarenal glands, or the adrenal glands. We already covered those, though. We covered those in the endocrine system, so we're not going to really look at those again. And these other anatomy points are just to give you reference. Okay, and I've got a better picture of this anatomy here in a minute. So what does this system do? You know, we always talk about the functions at the beginning of each of these chapters. So one of the functions of the kidneys is, well, the one that's most important, strangely, is missing here, and that is to remove waste products from the blood. You know, our principal waste product, the product that we make the most of, is carbon dioxide, right? Because most of our nutrients are carbon-based. Well, all of the nutrients are carbon-based. So pound per pound, we make more CO2 than anything else. But not all of our nutrients, nor our metabolic steps, can be broken all the way down to carbon dioxide. Okay, so we end up with these compounds that are too large to be breathed out, but they would accumulate in the body if there wasn't some way to wash them out or filter them out. So ultimately, the principal role of the urinary system is to get rid of those metabolic waste products. We talked about one already, urea. You know, as we take in protein in excess of what our bodies need for growth and maintenance, that nitrogen has to be removed, and so that the mitochondria can break down that amino acid. But then what do you do with the nitrogen? Well, you've got to get it out of the body somehow. So urea is one of those, creatinine is another. We'll talk about a few more. Okay, so that's the principal role. These are more secondary roles. So the body's blood volume and blood pressure are completely regulated by the kidney. Now, some students find this sort of counterintuitive, you know, because we talk about the heart in blood volume and blood pressure, right? So why doesn't the heart control that? Because it can't. The heart doesn't have any way of controlling water leaving the body. Okay, so the control center for blood volume and blood pressure is found in the kidneys, because the kidneys can affect blood volume, right, by increasing urine output or decreasing urine output. And the kidneys work using blood pressure. So if there isn't an adequate blood pressure, the kidneys can't perform their primary function, which is to get rid of waste products. So because the kidneys need blood pressure to function, the kidneys are in charge of blood pressure. Okay, and we'll talk much more about that system both in this chapter and in the next chapter when we talk about fluids and electrolytes. So very commonly in kidney disorders, blood pressure is affected. You know, so patients who are on dialysis, for example, in end-stage renal failure, oftentimes they fight very high blood pressure problems. And that's because the kidneys are sick, so they're trying to increase blood pressure to function better, but it's too high and the kidneys can't fix what's wrong with them anyway, so you get into this vicious cycle. So kidney and blood pressure go together, and we'll talk about that more later. We talked about one little bit already. Remember the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system? Well, renin comes from the kidneys, and aldosterone's effects are at the kidneys. So you can see the kidney is right at the cornerstone or at crossroads of the cardiovascular system and fluid balance. Okay, so that's one secondary function. Another is ion regulation. The kidneys are expert at getting rid of excess ions. You know, ions being tiny little molecules that dissolve very well in water. The kidneys are water processors, ultimately. So it's very easy for the kidneys to get rid of excess sodium, potassium, chloride, or calcium, or magnesium, or any of those other charged particles. Now, in addition to increasing excretion, the kidneys can also reduce excretion. You know, so let's say you are somewhere where there's very low salt content. You know, there really are places like that on Earth. Some of the rainforests, for example, have very low salt. So to keep your salt concentration at an appropriate level, one of the things the kidneys will do is reduce salt excretion, right? So you hold on to every little molecule of salt you can. So we'll talk more about that later. But regulation of ions. pH. The organ that affects pH the fastest is the lungs. Remember we talked about how CO2 and pH are related? Well, the second organ that affects pH is the kidneys. And that's because the kidneys can create acid or they can get rid of acid. They can also create base or get rid of base. So while the lungs control pH minute to minute, the kidneys are responsible for pH day to day, week to week. Okay, so the longer term control. The kidneys conserve valuable nutrients. Ultimately, the kidneys are filters, right? Blood with waste products goes in, and urine and clean blood comes out. Well, in that process, you don't ever want to have something of value end up in the urine, right? Because that's a waste. So glucose is an excellent example of this. There's glucose in the blood all the time because the brain needs that for its metabolism. Well, some of that glucose actually gets filtered out by the kidney and would appear in the urine if it wasn't for some conservation systems that prevent that from happening. So ultimately, in the urine, you should never find anything the body could use for something, right? So you shouldn't find amino acids, you shouldn't find sugars, you shouldn't find proteins, because those are all things the body can use. And again, we'll talk about how that works later. And then finally, removal of, well, I guess this is that, removal of drugs and toxins. Toxins you could call waste products, but I think that should be up here. But anyway, many of the medications that we give patients leave the patient's body through the kidney. It's one of the reasons why, you know, many of us have taken medicine at least once in our lives. Well, why do you have to take it twice a day? Why do you have to take it 3 times a day? Because all the while you're taking that medicine, your kidneys are filtering that out of your bloodstream because the kidneys see it as a toxin. It's not natural. It's not something the body made. It's not something the body can use, so it gets rid of it, right? So we have to keep putting medication in the patient because it's coming out of the patient all the time. Same thing with toxins, you know, and while we live pretty toxin-free in our modern world, you know, toxins are present in nature. You know, they're present in food, they're present in water. So one of the kidney and the liver sort of work together to either metabolize, that's what the liver does, toxins, or to get it out of the body, and that's what the kidney does. Okay, and we'll talk about all these things as we go, but that's the overview. Okay, so the digestive tract sits just underneath the anterior wall of the abdomen. The urinary tract, the kidneys, sit way, way in the back. They're on the posterior wall of the abdomen. In other words, you've got skin at your back, right? Muscles underneath that. You've got your vertebral column in front of that. And then just in front of the vertebral column, we have this stuff. So we have the kidneys. So the kidneys are very far back and high up under the corners of the rib cage in the back. So to orient you, we've taken all the digestive tract out, right? So we can see its entry and exit. Here's the esophagus. That would go into the stomach. Here's the rectum that would connect to the sigmoid colon. So we've taken the whole GI tract out, and we're looking down into the abdominal cavity without it. So we have the vena cava that runs the whole length of the posterior abdominal wall, and then it divides into the right and left iliac veins. The aorta comes up on the other side, so the vena cava is on the right, the aorta is on the left, right? These big arteries here are what feed the digestive tract, this 1, 2, and 3. We didn't talk about those, but you will later in your clinical lives. And then we have the right and left kidney. Now, this is not an error. The left kidney is usually higher than the right kidney in most people. The reason for that is because the liver takes up all of this space right here. So because the liver is such this massive organ, the right kidney can't get up as high as the left kidney can, because the liver's in the way. So in most people, it looks like this. Now, in all things anatomical, there is variation between people, right? Some people will have a left kidney that's way down here. Some people will have both kidneys way down here. Some people will have 2 kidneys that are joined at the top, called a horseshoe kidney. So there are lots of variants in human anatomy. What we learn in a class like this is the amorphous normal. You know, none of us are normal. But if you look at 1,000 patients, they kind of have these same patterns. So that's what we learn. It's one of the things that makes surgery so tricky is the surgeon doesn't know exactly where everything's going to be when he or she gets in there to do the work. Now today it's a lot easier because we have these great imaging techniques. You know, MRI, CT scan can identify a kidney that's not where it's supposed to be, but it still makes for a challenge. Yes.
So if someone's getting an organ donated and they need a left kidney, do they get a right kidney, or does it have to be a left?
No, they're both the same. And you raise an interesting point, which is in kidney transplants. Okay, so if somebody needs a new kidney. We would all think, because we're intelligent people, that you would go in and you would take the kidney out, you'd put the new kidney, you'd hook it up in the same spot, right? That's not how they do it. They put the new kidney, oftentimes they'll leave the old kidneys in place because they just shrivel up and scar. And the new kidney, they'll install down here. They'll hook it up to the aorta and the iliac vein down here in the lower, one of the lower quadrants of the abdomen, totally in not anatomic position at all. Why? It's an easier surgery. That's number one. Number two, the body doesn't care where the kidney is because the kidney processes blood using blood pressure. Blood pressure is everywhere. Blood is everywhere, so you can put it anywhere you want. And then the final reason is it's easier to inspect here. So after a transplant, you want to make sure the kidney isn't getting swollen or tender because those are signs of rejection. So they'll put it somewhere that they can feel, that the doctor, the physician assistant, or the nurse can feel that kidney so that they can assess its health more easily. So when you work with patients who've had kidney transplants, ask them where their kidney is because it's not going to be here or here like it is in the anatomical position. So good question. Okay, so the kidneys, because they work on blood, they have a massive blood supply. The arteries and veins going to and from the kidneys are huge. They're some of the largest in the body, which you can kind of tell here in this picture. This vein is as large as the artery that feeds 2/3 of the digestive tract, which is a much larger amount of tissue. And it's not because the kidneys need all that oxygen. It's because they're filtering blood all the time, so you have to send them a lot of blood. So we have a renal artery going to each kidney, which is behind here. And then we have a renal vein coming from each kidney. Because the vena cava sits next to the aorta, the left renal vein is longer than the right, and the right renal artery is longer than the left. Does that kind of make sense? So it's one of those asymmetries in the body. Then coming out of the center, the hilum of the kidney on each side, is the ureter, and it passes just in front of the first layer of muscles in the back. Okay, so this is the iliopsoas muscle. Remember that from your muscle chapter? The ureters literally sit right on top of that iliopsoas muscle on the very back wall of the abdomen. And then they go down here and they enter the urinary bladder, which sits just behind the pubic symphysis. It's one of the reasons why we have a pubic symphysis is to protect the bladder from injury. Okay. And all of this view is behind the peritoneal cavity. Remember, the peritoneum is that slick sheet that the abdominal contents live in. Well, that's been removed here. So this is all behind the abdominal cavity. All right. And when you look at it like this, it looks like the kidneys are very exposed from the side. But you have to remember that they sit way in the back. Okay, so I like this combination of pictures because it shows you that concept. All right, so we have ribs that come down. The 11th and 12th ribs do not come all the way around to the front like the others. Remember that? They're the floating ribs. So why do we have them? Well, one of the reasons we have them is to protect the kidneys. You know, the kidneys are full of blood and blood pressure all the time. So a injury directly to the kidney capsule would cause a kidney to rupture. So because of that, evolution has given us protection. So the kidney is protected on the back by the ribs, and do you see this thick layer of muscle right here? These are the muscles of the back, right? They help keep us upright in the human being. They're protected to the side by the vertebral column. One of the most protected places in all body, right, is the spinal column. And then in the front, they're protected by the soft, squishy abdominal contents, right? So you've got stomach in the way, you've got small intestine, omentum down the front, and then off to the side we have the spleen. And even the spleen really is very protected as well, like we talked about. It's tucked up underneath here on the left-hand side, right? So here's that kidney. The kidney is also packed in fat, right? All this yellow stuff is fat. So just like if you wanted to keep something fragile in a box from getting broken, you pack it with absorbable, energy-absorbing material. The kidney evolved like that too. So it's packed in this fat capsule to protect it even more. So, like we were just talking about, because of this hard-to-reach location, kidneys that are implanted aren't put in their anatomical position. So, why all this protection? We can live without a kidney, okay, but injury to a kidney in the wild, so to speak, would usually result in death because the kidney is a blood organ, so the animal would bleed out. So even though we have more kidney than we need, we still need this protection, at least our ancient ancestors did, because when the kidney breaks, it breaks badly, bad for the survival. Okay, so protected location. Okay, so if we break open the kidney, so we've cut it down its long ways, right? And we're going to look at its macroscopic anatomy. So we'll start with what we can see easiest. Okay, so here's the ureter, which is really just a tube. It's a smooth muscle tube. And as it comes up here into the hilum, so we've had multiple organs with hilum, hyla technically now, right? But the hilum is where things go in and out, okay? So the ureter comes up here, and then it expands into kind of a tree-like structure. It's still hollow, but it gets larger and it creates extra tubes, okay? So we call that expansion the renal pelvis right here, okay? And these branches, we call the branches calyces. Calyces is plural. Calyx is singular. Kind of a weird word, but calyx and calyces. So one calyx, many calyces. The big branches, like we see here and here, those are called a major calyx or major calyces, right? And then the smaller branches that go towards each of these cones, we call that a minor. So this is a minor calyx, this is a minor calyx. These are all minor calyces, right? And they're all heading up to the tip of these cone-shaped regions. And this little hill right here is called, not surprisingly, the renal papilla, right? We've heard that word before. Papilla is hill. So this little bump is the renal papilla. And at this area, at the renal papilla, this is where all the nephrons are going to dump the urine they're producing, right? So urine enters this system, this collecting system for urine at these renal papilla. Now, it doesn't have just like one hole each, right? Many nephrons all empty in the same spot. So the papilla has lots of little pipes, so to speak, that are exiting the kidney where the urine has been made. Okay, so that's sort of the inside. We look at the outside now. Okay, so the kidney has a fibrous capsule. It's a little bit like thin, tough leather, right? Like you'd find in a good pair of gloves. You know, it's thin and flexible, but it's tough, hard to puncture. Underneath that fibrous capsule, we have this layer of tissue here that's called the cortex, right? So this is hard to do with it. Okay, so do you see how this strip goes all the way around? That strip is the cortex, okay? And it's in the cortex, there's one part of the nephron. The nephron is the functional unit of the kidney. Much, much more on that as we get going here. But part of the nephron is found in this cortex region. The rest of it, so we have a cortex and a medulla. Okay, so this is cortex. So this is all medulla, right? You see how there's like two layers? Okay? And in the medulla, we have two different regions. We have these cone-shaped regions called renal pyramids, right? Because they're kind of pyramid-shaped. And then between the pyramids, we have these rectangular regions. We call those the renal columns, right? So this is a column, this is a column, this is a pyramid, this is a pyramid. Every pyramid ends in a papilla and a minor calyx, which join together to make a major calyx, renal pelvis, urinary. Okay, so we have cortex, medulla, pyramids, columns, papilla. Now, when we look at the kidney like this, it looks like these are triangles. The kidney is a three-dimensional thing. They're not triangles, they're cones, right? So it's like a funnel without the spout at the end. So they come out at you too. Okay. I think, like I said, this is all need to know anatomy because many of you will be working with patients who have kidney disorders and this anatomy comes up. It's also functional. There's different things in the renal pyramids than there is in the cortex or the columns. So the anatomy at the macroscopic level sort of matches the anatomy at the microscopic one. All right. So the nephron is the functional unit of the kidney. What do I mean by that? I mean it is the arrangement of cells into a system of tubes, like you see here, that allows the kidney to accomplish its functions. Okay, getting rid of waste products, controlling blood pressure, controlling blood volume, electrolytes, conserving nutrients, all of those things. And as we'll see later, the two different parts of the kidney, the cortex and the medulla, have different stuff in them. And one of the things that's different is we have two different kinds of nephrons. In some ways, it's almost like we have two different kinds of kidney in one. And this is something that, while not unique to the human being, is a pretty fancy mammal trick, right? Because it allows us to live both in dry environments and in wet environments because our kidneys can function a little bit like desert kidneys and a little bit like rainforest kidneys. So, and part of the reason for that is we have these two different kinds of nephrons. Okay, up here in the cortex are these short little, they're not mini, but they're small compared to their bigger cousins. These are cortical nephrons, right? And we're going to talk about all these bends and twists as we go. But for now, I just want you to see this is sort of little, this is sort of much larger, right? And one of the key things that's different is the length of this tube here. You see, it's long, but it's not nearly as long as this huge thing that goes down enough. Okay, so most of the nephrons in the kidney are these, cortical nephrons. So most of our urine output is produced by these. However, these juxtamedullary nephrons, the larger cousins, their principal role is in allowing us to conserve water very, very well. Right? That's why I call it a desert kidney. In the desert, you've got to hold on to every little drop of water because there's not much around. And the juxtamedullary nephrons allow us to do that. Now, this is a crazy big word, right? So medulla, the medulla is the center part. Remember we just talked about that, the medulla? Juxta just means near to. Okay, so juxtamedullary is near to the medulla because these nephrons live right next to the medulla and dip down into it. All right, so all told, it's about 85% of the little ones, 15% of the giant ones. And it's not like they work independently. The fact that we have these big giant ones actually makes the smaller ones able to work more efficiently at conserving water, which we'll talk more about later. Okay, so why do they introduce this now? Because we're talking anatomy, right? So we have the cortex and we have the medulla, and we have two different kinds of nephrons in those two different places. All right. So this is the core of what this whole chapter is about, is really this right here, the amazing nephron. So the kidney is made up of millions of these. There's about 1 million in each one, okay? And each nephron, even though there's 1 million of them, they all have the same parts, they all have the same structure, and each of those different regions functions in a different way. So all told, the nephron is one thing that has many different regions that do many different things, okay? And we're going to talk about each one of these as we go. But just as a way of introducing this anatomy here, the nephron starts with this kind of ball-shaped region called the renal corpuscle. And the corpuscle is a little tuft of capillaries that is surrounded by a capsule. And in between the capillary and the capsule is fluid. Fluid that has been pushed out of the blood and into this capsule, right? So we call that the glomerulus, is the little tuft of capillaries. And it has an artery that goes in and an artery that goes out, and both of those can change, right? But we'll get into that when we get to the physiology of it. So this is where urine production begins. It starts with blood. We take blood and we push the blood against a filter membrane, right? Probably many of you have done that in chemistry by now. Filtered some precipitate out by pulling it through a membrane. Well, that's what the glomerulus does. So what comes out of the glomerulus is the stuff that's in blood that is small enough to make it through the filter, okay? And we call that filtrate, right? So that's this green arrow. Filtrate leaves the blood. Then it enters this series of tubes, right? So we have a series of winding tubes that happen right away. We call that the proximal convoluted tubule. Convoluted just means winding, right? Like a mountain road is convoluted. Proximal because it's early in the nephron. So the fluid goes through that. While it goes through that tube, stuff happens to it. Namely, water is reabsorbed and nutrients are reabsorbed. Then the fluid makes its way down to the big long loop. We call this the nephron loop, right? So it goes down and up. And as it goes down and up, first water leaves on the way down, then salt leaves on the way up. Both of those are things we want to hold on to, right? Because water and salt, we wouldn't want to have to be drinking all the time and eating salt all the time. So we conserve those things because they're of use to us, right? Then we come up to the second set of winding tubes. This is the distal convoluted tubule, also called the DCT. And here we get further refinement of this filtrate. We remove some more things that we want to keep, like salt and water. We dump some things we'd like to get rid of, like toxins or excess potassium or excess calcium, into the urine. And then that fluid now goes back down through the collecting system. Okay, so to put this in context with this, so here's the glomerulus, right, and the corpuscle. Proximal tubule, here's the loop. It dips down into the medulla a little, comes back up into the cortex, winds around again, and then the collecting system goes all the way through the medulla and out into the minor calyx at the end. That's for those cortical nephrons. For the juxtamedullary nephron, we're still up here in the cortex mostly, but we dip way down into the medulla for the loop part, comes back up, and then the collecting system goes back through the medulla again. And this passage through the medulla is evolutionarily on purpose, because as the urine flows from here to here, lots of water is pulled out. So one of the reasons why our urine output is relatively small for our size is because we conserve water very well because of this medulla system, which we'll talk in much more detail after the break. Okay. So ultimately, as you're studying, this is the goal, right? You should be able to, from memory, right, draw a nephron. Now, does it have to be anatomically accurate? No. I just want you to be able to draw, this comes before this, because, you know, the order of things. And you should be able to describe what happens in each section. If you can do that here, you've got about 75% of this chapter's information. Okay, so that's the core of it, really, is the nephron, which is why I introduced that kind of group. And for this purpose, you should also understand the collecting system too. Right? But you see, it's a lot less complicated than all this, right? The collecting system has a bunch of nephrons that all dump into it. So like, here's from a nephron, here's from a nephron, here's a couple more, and then they make their way out. Okay. So, since the nephron runs on blood, right, you've got to push blood into the corpuscle here in order to get anything happening, in order to get this filtrate in the first place. It means that the kidney has a complex and unique blood supply. You know, typically in the body, arteries go in to capillaries, capillaries form together to make veins, and veins go back out of the organ, right? So it's like a circuit. Well, in the kidney, instead of having a circuit, we have more of a complicated tree pattern instead. Okay, so here's the renal artery coming from the aorta, right? Enters the hilum, and it divides into the segmental arteries. So we get a couple of those. And then running through each column is an interlobar artery. So that's this, and so on. Okay? Now this is where it gets a little unusual. So the interlobar arteries are connected together here, connected to one another, by this arch-like artery that we call the arcuate artery. That just means arched. Okay, so we have this interconnection. And then sticking up from this arcuate artery are these, they kind of look like branches of a tree, and hanging off those branches, the leaves are the glomeruli inside that corpuscle at the beginning. So each one of these little balls is one of these, right? It's attached to a nephron. Now, this has been hugely exaggerated to show you scale, right? These are much smaller than you can see with the naked eye, like they're showing you here. But so from the arcuate artery, we have these cortical radiate arteries. Cortical because they're in the cortex. Radiate because they radiate out like a sun, right? They, you know, are all sticking out in opposite directions or like rays, right? And so then these little balls, these are the afferent arterioles and the glomeruli attached. Okay, so not the typical blood flow pattern. You know, well, where's the capillary? Well, we're going to get to that later. I mean, technically, the first capillary is the glomerulus, that tuft of capillaries, and then there's a second capillary bed that goes through this too. So it's a portal system. Again, spoilers. We'll talk more about that later. Okay, so that's the arterial supply. Well, where does this blood go? Well, eventually, it collects into these cortical radiate veins, which empty into an arcuate vein right here. So that's this guy, through interlobar veins, segmental veins, and then eventually out through the renal vein. So at least they match, right? So you only have to learn one blood flow pattern. This is blood going in, this is blood going out. Now, why is it like this? Why not just, you know, circuits like you see everywhere else, where blood goes here and then back to the heart? Well, this whole kidney works using blood pressure. So by having this system of interconnectedness of arteries, it means that the pressure going in here is much more evenly distributed all throughout the cortex, so that all the nephrons get the same chance, so to speak, at the blood's blood pressure. Okay, so that's one reason. Another reason is because the kidney works using blood flow, any blockage would shut a whole part of the kidney down. So like in the heart, when you get a coronary artery that's clogged, the heart muscle that coronary artery serves dies, right? Because there is no backup path. There's no other way for blood to get there. Well, in the kidney, we don't have that problem. Like an infarct or a blood clot in the kidney doesn't usually result in much destruction because there's all these other paths for blood to get places. So let's say you had a clot right here. Well, it wouldn't matter because blood can still get here from these two paths, right? So it makes this system really robust. And it's not that the reason for that is without the kidneys, we end up dead. Now, why not have coronary arteries like that? Who knows? If you could redesign the human being, that's one of the things you do, is you'd make a couple of connections in between the coronary arteries so that it would have the same resiliency as the kidney does. And remember, we talked about the circle of Willis in the brain, the cerebral arterial circle. Same idea. Multiple blood flow paths mean that one clot doesn't bring the whole organ down, or at least one whole part of it down. Okay, so the vascular anatomy important enough. Okay, so since we have this complex anatomy, it's important to look at where are the capillaries, right? Remember I said the capillaries are the business end of the cardiovascular system. Well, in this case, we have two capillary beds. So here is blood coming in from one of those cortical arcuate, or those cortical radiate arteries, right? Into here. This is that glomerulus, the little tuft of capillaries here. So this is a capillary bed. So this is the first one, okay? This blood, or these capillaries come back together to form another arteriole. So we have two arterioles, right? Which makes this a portal system. This is the third and last portal system that we encounter in this semester. Right, so the first one was in the pituitary, right, the hypophyseal portal system. The second one, the largest in the body, is the hepatic portal system. And then this one is the capillary portal system, or the glomerular portal system. All right, so we have blood going in. Here, I'll just put a heart, right? And then we have our first capillary bed, like that. So this is the glomerulus. And that makes this the afferent arteriole. And this the efferent arteriole. Our unfortunate words again, right? Afferent and efferent. It would be better if they called them in and out, right? Because at least they don't sound the same that way. But this is what we get. We get afferent and efferent. So typically, after a capillary bed, you go from arteriole to venule, right? And then venule to vein and vein back to the heart. Well, here we don't have that. We go from arteriole to a different arteriole. And then we have a second capillary bed here that wraps around the tubules of the kidney. So we call those peritubular capillaries. I'm just going to say cap for short. And then now we get to a vein, right? Which then will go back to the heart. So two capillaries between heart and back to the heart, that makes it a portal system, right? So when we look at our picture here, you can see those two sets of capillaries. So here's the first set. They join back together to make this efferent arteriole. And then they split all apart to make this really elaborate capillary bed that follows the nephron loop all the way down, right, and back up. So we call all of these capillaries around here, these are all peritubular capillaries. And this arrangement didn't arise by accident. The reason these capillaries wrap around these tubes is because stuff is going to go into these nephron tubes and out of the tubes. Well, from where? from the blood, right? So things from the blood are going to go in, things from the tubules are going to go back into the blood. So in order to make that system work, we've got to coat or cover these tubes with blood that's going to take what comes in away and bring what's going to go out in. Okay, so we have these peritubular capillaries. Now, in the big ones, in the big juxtamedullary nephrons, we still have the same setup, right? Here's our first capillary bed, the glomerulus. Here's the efferent arteriole. And we still have peritubular capillaries wrapped all around the convoluted tubules. But then we have this set of tubules that goes way down, follows the nephron loop down, and then comes way back up. And because this is long and skinny, we have capillaries that are straight, right? You see how these are very straight compared to these are all curvy? Because of they're straight, we call them vasa recta. Recta is straight. So these are straight vessels, is literally what this word means, vasa recta. And the importance of these will become clear later, but by following the nephron loop down and back up, it means that the concentrations of things in the blood is able to normalize before it goes back into the rest of the circulation, which I'm not going to get into that now. We'll come back and I'll talk about this again later, but today's anatomy day. So we have the peritubular capillaries, and then we have these vasa recta that go down and back up. All right, we'll ask some questions, and then we'll call it a day. So the outermost layer of the kidney is the... I don't have it again today. I've just been terrible with software. Sorry. Don't hit me too hard on my evaluations for that. Okay, so the outermost layer is called the what? Good, the cortex. Everybody agree? So the medulla is the band just inside the capsule. Oh, wait, the outermost layer is the capsule. D is the better answer, right? So capsule, underneath the capsule medulla, underneath the capsule cortex, underneath the cortex medulla. Inside the medulla, we have the pyramids and the columns. And then in the center, we have the renal pelvis with its major and minor calyces. Right? So that's all from this one. This is a star-worthy slide, really, because this is a lot of your anatomy of the kidney right there. Okay. Triangular or conical structures located in the renal medulla are the what? They have the pyramids, right? And separating those are the columns. Inside the columns are where you find the arteries and veins. Those I can't think of the name. What is it? Interlobar arteries. All right. So the glomerular capsule and the glomerulus together make up which part of the nephron? Yeah, corpuscle. So nowadays we call the cell, right? But in the old days they called the cell a corpuscle because they knew it was roundish, right? So corpuscle in Latin means a thing that is round. And the first part of the nephron has this roundish look because it's got the glomerulus inside and then this roundish capsule all around it. Now, the much more common name for that capsule is Bowman's capsule. Just like sphincter of Oddi is the more common name for that hepatico-duodeno pancreatico thing. Well, Bowman's is glomerular capsule. That's what you'll still hear. So you need to know both names. Okay. So urine, or what will become urine, first passes from the glomerular capsule. So first it enters the capsule. Then what comes next? Yes, the proximal convoluted tubule. Yep. And the end of the nephron, the portion of the nephron that empties into the collecting ducts or system is the distal convoluted tubule. In between those two things is the nephron, right? Which goes down and then back up. So the U-shaped segment of the nephron is the nephron loop. Good. Okay, so just like the capsule is called Bowman's capsule, the loop is called the loop of Henle, right? The proper anatomical name today is nephron loop. But again, you're going to hear people call it the loop of Henle, so you should know what that is. You know, maybe 30 years from now, when all of the people who learned loop of Henle are dead, then you can just go and call it the nephron loop again. But then, of course, you'll have gotten used to calling it the loop of Henle, and the problem goes on forever, which is why you can't always change the name of things. I think I was talking about this before, but there was a movement, I don't know, in the 1970s or 80s, to try to get rid of all the names, the proper names of people in medicine. It didn't work. All it meant is now we have two names to learn things. So, or you can try to correct your attending physicians, or get the people that you have superior, or not superiority, but seniority on you, and see how that goes. Okay, well, we'll call it there.